Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may begin from thee and by thee, be hampered through Christ our Lord. Amen. Queen of heaven, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so this conference title is What is Shame? But what we really want to be able to answer in a somewhat deep level is, why is it today that people seem to have no shame whatsoever? First of all, what is shame? Second, why is it that people don't have it? And how to actually develop a proper sense of shame, because there can also be an improper sense of shame. So the first thing we have to do is do like we always do, is we actually have to define the terms. So shame is defined as a perception, got to redo this. It's a fear, St. Thomas says, it's a fear of being perceived as lowly. Okay, so we want to unpack that a bit. First of all, it's a fear, so it's actually, shame is actually in the irascible appetite. That's actually where it is. It's where the person actually, he's afraid that people are going to actually look at him and look at him lower than what he actually is, or what he himself thinks he is, and that's where the real problem lies. But even this fear is actually based on a perception of himself primarily, because sometimes people can experience shame being around people when in point in fact the other people aren't even looking at him. They're not even perceiving him in that manner. So it's a perception on the side. It's based on a perception. It's a judgment of ourselves that there's something in me that is lowly, and I'm afraid that if people see that, then as a result of that, I'm going to be actually seen as lowly, and they will judge me as lowly, right? And we actually want people to judge us in a certain manner. Because of fallen original sin, we actually, because of concupiscence, we desire the delight in other people perceiving us or judging us in a higher state than we actually are, rather than as we truly are, right? So that's where the real key is going to come from that. Okay, so it's a fear of being perceived as lowly. Now, what we have to do is we have to talk about this term lowly, okay? So, lowly just basically means that there's actually a hierarchy of being. There's actually, if you look, St. Thomas says, the principle of hierarchy of being is that from the lowest rock all the way to the highest, to God, ultimately, there is a continuous grade of beings between that rock and God. There's a continuous grade of beings. So you go from rocks to plants to animals to human beings to angels to God, right? So that's the general thing. But that indicates that there's actually a recognition that our lowliness, that where we're at perceived in relationship to all that, what people's judgment of us in relationship to the hierarchy of being can be based on a number of different things. In the order of nature, all human beings are the same because we all have human nature. That is, we're composite of body and soul. But in the order of accidents, so the accidents are those things which subsist or are in my nature, we're not all the same. So, in fact, every single set of accidents, so not just are all the natures in a hierarchy, but all the accidents are also in a hierarchy. And this is something that is really ends up getting denied today because people want this egalitarian where everybody's the same and everybody's different. Now, part of the hierarchy of being is, I can never remember the name of this principle. I just absolutely have to memorize that name. But basically it says, if two beings are in the same category of being and are different, de facto, one is higher than the other. Okay, let me say that again. If two beings are in the same category of being and are different, de facto, one is higher than another. Okay. This is a really key indicator because it means that as human beings in relationship to accidents, because we're all different, on the order of accidents, we are not the same. We actually know this we actually know this intuitively. So, for example, we know in the order of accidents that say someone who is, there's different degrees of intelligence. We also know that intelligence is actually better than looks, than physical beauty and things of this sort. So we know that, or even within physical beauty, there are certain kinds of physical beauty that are just more beautiful than others, right? And so this is a kind of one of those always classic problems where the wife, do you think I'm the most beautiful woman that ever existed? Well, no, of course not. Should be the response. And then when she gets her feelings hurt, you say, well, first of all, where do you think you're even in competition with Our Lady, right? So, because even on a physical level, they said she was extraordinarily beautiful. She had absolute perfect proportion. So this is in relationship to like facial features and the like, and so she was perfect on a physical level even. Okay, so the point being is that on the order of accidents, they're different, right? Okay, now there's different kinds of accidents, but this is where we have to really kind of get into this. If you look at the part of the accidents of man are the various faculties that we have. And the reason we know they're accidents and that they're not part of the nature of us is because of the fact that if I were able, the faculties are the ability to act or perform some type of activity. And if they were part of my nature, if I performed an activity and then I changed to a different activity, if they were the same as my nature would change each time I changed my activity. That's how we know they're actual accidents in us, which basically means I have this nature, which then is able to perform activities through these accidental qualities. These things that exist in my nature but are not the same thing as my nature. So your hair is not the same thing as your being a human. In other words, the color of your hair, I should say, is not the same as your being a human. The color of your eyes, your race, your gender, these are all accidents. In fact, in the order of accidents, gender is what's called an inseparable accident. This is what's so ironic. It's inseparable because once you're a male, that's it, you're male. So even if they do surgery, you're still a male, right? Genetically, etc. By the very nature of what's there, you're just a mutilated male now is what's happening. Okay. Now these faculties have different objects. And different objects are also in a hierarchy of being. So if you actually look, so each faculty is ordered towards a specific kind of thing, and so the faculty is the ability to perform some action, and that action is ordered towards some thing, some object. And these objects are in different categories of being, so some are higher than others, and that means de facto that the action, certain actions are higher than others in relationship to our faculties. And so if you actually look at the nature of our faculties, what determines that one activity is higher than another is what, do you think? What do you think it is? What's that?
What it's ordered for?
Yeah, but what does that mean?
Someone has a higher level of responsibility in society as a result, and that makes them higher?
Kind of.
To do with how approximate it is to God?
That's it. So remember when I said it's from the lowest rock all the way through ascending to think whatever my faculty is ordered towards in the context of that hierarchy of being determines what is higher. So obviously spiritual things, immaterial things are higher than physical things, right? And so that, which we know intuitively. Now, unfortunately, today people are messed up mentally, so they don't necessarily see that. But that means there's a hierarchy. So whatever my faculties are specifically ordered towards means that this faculty is actually higher than that faculty. And even within, like, say, the senses, there's actually a hierarchy of senses in which touch is the lowest. Let me get a different pen here. Touch is the lowest. And sight is the highest. Why is sight the highest? So it goes touch, taste, smell, and hearing, and then sight. what do you notice in relationship to this hierarchy of senses from the bottom to the top?
The top is more acute.
It can be, that's right. Although St. Thomas does say that touch gives us the most specific of information, but the least amount of knowledge. But that all being said, there's something else that's going on here.
Information seems to be less material.
Bingo. So with touch, you actually have to be in physically contact with the material thing. Whereas sight is more abstracted from the thing. It's still a material operation, obviously. But as you go, it becomes less material in the operation. Okay, so we have the senses, which actually put me in touch with what? Things that are material, more or less by varying degrees. Then after the senses, then I actually have my various appetites, like my concupiscible appetite and my irascible appetite, and which has emotions. Why are these below, like what St. Thomas calls the passive intellect, which is the memory, imagination, etc.? Why are the appetites below that? The passive intellect. By the way, I'm dragging this all out because this becomes the reason why people have no shame. Why are the appetites below the passive intellect?
Isn't the same thing as Nick just said?
Yeah.
That one is more toward the abstract and the other toward the material.
Yeah, so the passive intellect, you can consider something independently of whether you actually desire a thing. And so also, it is more abstract in the sense that the appetites are ordered by nature towards very specific material things, whereas these use material things to understand and to have the imagery, but that they're a preparation for the next higher, of course, which is then the possible intellect, which then presents it to the will. Is the will higher than the possible intellect? This is a key thing.
Yes.
No, it is not.
Oh.
If you notice, it was all the women saying it was.
Yeah.
Why is, there's a reason for that. Why is that? Let me ask you this. What is the beatific vision?
God in His full glory.
No, I want to know exactly in what does the beatific vision consist?
Your intellect holding, not really holding, I guess thinking about God.
Yeah.
Something,
It's God taking his substance and pressing it against your possible intellect. That's what the beatific vision is. The activities of the will are concomitant to that. They follow upon that automatically. And so God joins himself to your highest faculty. That's what he does. Why is it that the possible intellect is higher than the will? It has, again, to do with their objects. What's the object of the intellect?
To know love.
Truth.
Truth.
To know God.
What's the object of the intellect, of the will?
To do your
discover
own
it, to
thing.
seek after it.
The good. Yeah, to seek after the truth. Because the good is always something that's true in some sense. But as a result of that, the will is also a blind faculty. It can only act when something's presented to it by the intellect, which actually knows it. So there's a dependency on that. Same with the appetites. And so the intellect is the highest faculty in man. This is something that is systematically denied. Now, the Franciscans used to say that it was the will because St. Paul says, among their faith, hope, and charity, in the sense, charity is the highest. Okay, as St. Thomas says, it's not because charity, it's not because the intellect or the will is higher than the intellect as a result because it gets charity. It's because of the fact that faith is not as certain and doesn't tend towards its object with the same degree of fixedness as charity does. And charity persists. In other words, faith is actually an indicator that we're in a state of imperfection, not in the sense of moral imperfection or spiritual imperfection, but that we don't actually see the object of faith yet. Whereas through charity, you can love the actual object of charity, which is God. So and in the next life, charity and hope dissipate, they're gone. And the only thing left is charity, of course. But the beatific vision then is not pressed to the will, it's actually God infuses in the possible intellect what's called the lumen gloriae, the light of glory, which raises the intellect's capacities high enough to where then when he presses it on the intellect, we can actually see him. Okay, so why did we go through all of this? Well, part of the faculties also are, so even below the sight, hearing, taste, and touch is like the locomotive faculty. This is the ability to move from one location to another. But then there's other faculties as well. There's the augmentative faculty. This is the ability to grow. I'll just give it to you now, but eventually I'm actually going to write a technical article on it. It's the fact that the augmentative faculty from the time of conception to the time of adulthood does not change, and we see one continuous fusion that we actually know that the immortal soul is present at the time of conception. Okay, that all being said. That's the ability to grow, augmentative faculty. Then there's, in addition, below that is actually then there's the nutritive faculty, is actually below both of these. That's the ability to take food in and things of that sort. If you look at plants, one plant is higher than another based upon whether, actually the locomotive faculty goes up here. They have nutritive, and then they can grow, and then above that are things that can actually move, right? And then above that, but in the context of the nutritive and augmentative faculty before the locomotive faculty is also the generative faculty. This is the ability to have children or to replicate yourself or to propagate your species, okay? These faculties are generally speaking considered below these faculties because these deal with sense knowledge, and knowledge is higher than these things are, generally speaking. And some of these are actually rooted in this. Obviously, you can't have touch. Without touch or sight or hearing or something, you're not going to be able to have, you can have locomotion, but it's not going to be done very well. In nutritive, the nutritive faculty depends on the sense of touch, and it's also taste in a certain sense, because every single thing that you ingest, you have to touch it physically. It has to come into you physically, okay? So that all being said, this means that these faculties are actually below even sense knowledge. Okay. Lowly means that I have... that there's something in me, so there's this hierarchy of being from the perfect to from the imperfect to the perfect, but also from lower beings to higher beings. And so sometimes so we can just say lower beings, so we can just say, the things that are lower to the things that are higher, okay. And there's this hierarchy that goes above us. In the order of accidents, from what I can gather, there's only one individual that had the perfection of all of the accidents in all their categories, and that's Christ. Okay. So that being the case, then the rest of us have a mishmash of certain accidents that are lower and certain accidents that are higher. So obviously some people are good looking, some people are intelligent. Rarely do you find someone who's good looking and intelligent. Rarely. Once in a while you do. And then, by intelligent, we're talking extremely intelligent. And so there's this hierarchy. But also, in relationship to choices that we make, what objects we choose to pursue, that level of object determines the dignity or the whether it's a low or a high object in relationship to what I choose. So if I choose a low object, that means my choice is lower. If I choose a higher object, that means my choice is higher, okay? And so ultimately, what this basically means is that should we choose the lower things? Yes, but only when it's appropriate or when reason indicates these things should be pursued at this time. For example, obviously eating, which is part of the nutritive faculty, is below sitting around contemplating the eternal verities, right? It's obviously a lower activity, but you can't do this all the time. You can't sit around contemplating God continuously, unless you reach the transforming union, of course. But you can't just sit and only think about God and only read and do this, that, and then just neglect your augmentative or your nutritive faculty because you're going to die, right? So there's certain times when reason says you have to stop this activity, and then you have to pursue a lower activity, but the pursuit of that lower activity should not be done for the sake of that lower object. You pursue that lower object for the sake of the higher object. The reason I eat is so that I can go back to engaging in these higher activities. Okay. The lower thing should never be the thing for which I'm ultimately striving for. I choose these things because of the fact that they're higher. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, part of the problem is so what is shame is? Shame occurs when I have chosen a lower object when reason dictated I shouldn't choose this. And so what's happened is I've lowered myself so that instead of using these lower things to gain a higher thing, so I can keep building myself up to this higher thing, I've chosen a lower thing. And so what happens is with shame is because my conscience knows I've chosen a lower thing when reason told me I shouldn't have, I know I'm lowly because I've chosen something lowly, I've pursued something lowly, which lowers me in my own accidents, both morally and in virtue, etc. And so there's a knack when I'm around other people, that means I'm going to perceive, they might find out that I've pursued this lowly thing, and as a result of that, I have a fear that they're going to find this thing out, and the fear is once they discover it, then there's going to be the evil that's in, because fear is the appetite in which there is a future evil which cannot be overcome. And so the fear ensues. And as a result of that, I realize that if people see me as lowly, I'm not going to be overcome that. And that's just because of the fact that I'm lowly, right? Okay. So why am I going into all of this? It means that when our faculties are working properly and we understand this hierarchy, when we follow these things, etc., then it means that when I engage in these lower things in appropriate fashion, in the right context, and they can actually contribute to higher goods. Some of them can also contribute to charity, so sitting down and eating with people can contribute to charity, etc. But it pursues the higher things. Whereas if I just sit down and go to the kitchen and just rubble and just shove it down my throat, right? Well, that's pursuing in a lowly manner. But the real problem has to do with in our own culture is the pursuits of those things that pertain to the generative faculty. People pursue matters that pertain to the sixth commandment at a time in which is contrary to reason, or reason says they shouldn't, or at least reason that operates according to the natural law. And so as a result of that, let me back up and state that, because that's actually going to be the launching pad to the next part of this lecture. Reason, which operates according to the natural law, knows that if it's engaging in these lowly things, then people are going to perceive it as lowly, whereas if it's engaging in these things according to right reason, then there is no shame involved, because it's done according to the way it's supposed to be done, right? So married couples, because marriage is a noble thing, it's a high thing, but the generative act is a lowly thing in the order of this hierarchy. It's not evil. We have to keep that clear. In the context of marriage, it's not morally evil, it's not physically evil. Even St. Thomas says that you can set aside the use of reason for a short period of time in the case of this particular act for the sake of the good of the species. So it's actually a pursuit of a higher thing. But that has to be its ordering, which is life ultimately. Okay. But the point being is that this, engaging in this in the context of marriage makes it a morally good act, but it's still a lowly act. It's above eating and a few other things, but not much more than that. Okay. And that's why it's important for people to realize that the primary aspect of marriage is not in relationship to the conjugal act. That's what we all think. It's like, I get married and then I get to do this. No, that's actually not the issue. The issue is yeah, it's true if you get married you can do this, but that's only because of the fact that this particular activity begets certain things called children that require an enormous amount of care and protection and nurturing and bringing forth. And so that's what the marriage is ultimately ordered for, is to get the children, to have children, get them to the age of reason. Okay. So if the generative faculty, if that activity then is subordinated to a higher good, which I just got done talking about, then there's no shame involved in it. It's actually a good thing. But it's still a lowly act. And this is something we have to keep in mind. The fact that there's so much pleasure associated with it, St. Thomas says, doesn't mitigate the fact that it's still a lowly act. Okay. So, what happens? Why is it that people have no shame? Well, I think people don't have shame today in a variety of different sets of categories. Not just in relationship to the sixth commandment, but in a variety of different categories. Okay. The first is, I said that when reason acts according to the natural law, it sees that there are times you have to engage in lowly acts, because in doing that, then I can continue to pursue the higher acts, right? Okay. Whereas if I just terminate, when I'm not even pursuing the higher acts, I'm not doing for those higher acts, but I'm pursuing it purely for that, then that's when it becomes lowly. And so the intellect, when it acts according to the natural law, reason sees these are good things as long as they're within a certain context and rightly ordered. If they're outside of that, then it becomes lowly. And that means it becomes shameful to engage in them. Okay. But this means that the intellect actually has to be able to judge reality for what it is. It has to be able to judge the reality of all these different things for what they actually are. And that's why if reason, when it's properly ordered, realizes that when the appetites are raging, reason recognizes that these things are pursuing as something that's not good for me, right? So it is not, which can happen. You can sometimes have your appetites let out of control, but if the possible intellect can still make a proper judgment, it's not every single time our judgment's precipitated. Sometimes we know my appetites are out of whack here, right? But there are times, though, when the intellect the appetites can precipitate the judgment of the possible intellect. So if you go online, there is a conference which I gave to, I think it was St. Thomas's More Society. I can't remember who I gave it for. But it's basically on the occultation of the natural law. How is it that the natural law in people, we have these natural inclinations towards these specific goods that God designed us for. How can these things get messed up? And St. Thomas says there are two fundamental ways in which the inclinations of the natural law become clouded, and we start pursuing things that are different from those things that are proper to the natural law. He said it's either by sin or by bad formation. But if you look at those two, they have the same mechanism. So that's what we want to go into really quickly, and then we'll talk, and then from there we can see why people have no shame today. So as I mentioned, you have the five senses. You've seen this chart 100 times. You've actually heard some of this stuff already. So you got the five senses. Those are unified by the common sense power and expressed into the imagination, and then also into the memory at the same time. The cogitative power looks at what's in the image and imagination, goes back to the memory, it merges that information with what's in the imagination. It also puts a perspective on it and an assessment of that thing, and from that arises the emotions. And then you have an intellect, which abstraction, which we won't get into, but you got the possible intellect, which then, through an act of judgment, looks back at the image in the imagination in order to make its judgment. Now what happens is when bad formation occurs, it comes in through the senses, because as Aristotle said, 99% of good education is presenting to the senses the right images that get formed in the imagination so that the right judgments can be made. Okay. So what happens is then the judgment, because the imagery is false, it's being presented when you have bad formation, the judgment ends up off. And each time we make a judgment, about that particular thing and it's false, it starts to develop an intellectual habit. And that habit starts inclining our intellect to judge in that specific way. And eventually it gets to the point where I can't see outside this habit that I have, right? Without grace, of course. So this is what we're actually seeing today. So this is why by the time these millennials get out, or the millennials or the younger kids are now getting Gen Zs and all these people are getting out of college, the intellectual formation has been so habitual. We've even seen this. I talked about this in the conference I did on brainwashing. It's become so habitual between the news media and the formation, etc., that people's intellectual judgments are actually contrary to reason. And so as a result, the natural inclination of the intellect to grasp the truth or grasp reality for what it is has been clouded. They can't do it anymore because of the intellectual habits become very entrenched. But the possible intellect can also, so that's one, that's how bad formation ends up messing people up. Okay. Then the possible intellect presents the object to the will, and then if the will decides it wants something that's evil, St. Thomas says it can't will evil for its own sake. Now, we've talked about this before. And so as a result, the will has to move the possible intellect to make a judgment in which it separates out the evil of the thing from the good so that the will can actually will the good, because the will can only will the good, either apparent good or true good. So it can only will the good. As a result of that, the intellect has to be moved to separate out the evil from the thing. That means in that very act, the intellect is being moved contrary to its nature. Its nature is to know the truth. You're moving it to look at this thing falsely, that this thing is not a part of this, or that I can actually look at this thing purely from the point of view of the good. As that, and then after that, it presents it to the will, and then the will can choose it, and then it moves the lower faculties, which of course get the wrong image, and then the cogitative power now has these wrong associations and wrong memories, etc., based upon your habit. And once the will keeps doing that, then it becomes so habitual that the person can't see the truth of it. This is why we see people who start out lying, and they lie so much that by the time they're president of the United States, they lie so habitually they don't know what is true and what's false. That's literally what you see. Okay. But the other part of it is that if I choose to pursue something that's pleasurable, that is contrary to reason, St. Thomas says that the pleasure precipitates my judgment in that moment, and then he says, I go from knowing, for example, I'll use Bessie Sue as always my example. So so the person knows that fornication's immoral, but then Bessie Sue, who is knocked down, drag out, gorgeous, walks into the room, and then the pleasure of seeing her and then her suggestions and talking to him precipitate his judgment, and so he thinks it's okay in this particular circumstance. But then Bessie Sue keeps hanging around. And over the course of time, he keeps willing this, moving his intellect to ignore the fact that fornication is immoral. And eventually, he gets to the point where the intellect, actually, because of its habit, actually thinks that fornication in general is okay now at this point. And then, after a while, not only is it's okay, eventually becomes good. We actually saw that progression in our own culture. We went from a time in which it was very clear, before the greatest generation, it was very clear that fornication was immoral. And they knew it, and they adhered to that understanding, and they believed it. It doesn't mean that the roaring 20s weren't a problem. I'm not getting that. I'm talking about those who were religious by bent, etc. Then, in the 50s, what happened was that's when the fornication started in earnest. Even though we all think it started in the 60s, it didn't. It began in the 50s. And so what happened is that they knew it was wrong, but because of this, maybe in this instance, and then that's when you started seeing the fornication happen. By the time you get to the 60s and 70s, it starts breaking down that it's immoral. By the time you get to the 80s, there's nothing wrong with it if you love them, right? And now it's actually the conventional wisdom. You should live together before you get married. So we actually saw that very intellectual occurrence that happens to us start to break down to where we begin to see that this is actually good. So what happens is that when the judgment is precipitated, or if I get the wrong formation, my natural inclinations to judge this hierarchy of being, these things as they actually are, begins to break down, and things start to become exaggerated. So now I tend to think that things that pertain to the generative faculty are the highest, or the greatest, or the things that are the most important, or the thing I should pursue. I'll give you an example of how we've seen this actually now occur. They did a poll among kids between the ages of 18 and 22, and this was about 5 years ago, and they asked them, if you were going to become famous, how would you like to become famous? A majority of the kids said they would like to become famous by being a porn star.
Whoa.
Oh yeah.
Really?
Oh yeah. For them, that becomes the highest thing. So that knowledge, the actual pursuit of knowledge or truth is not the highest thing anymore to them. And this is something and you actually see this. So as a result, what's happened is in the past, what any of us would have considered shameful if people found out that we had done has now become, oh no, they're happy to get themselves out there and put pictures of themselves nude on the internet, etc., right? Because all this stuff has been inverted. And so the reason they don't have any shame is because of this habitual sin that our culture engages in, and now the bad formation. So now people don't consider things shameful. But it's not just in matter of relation to the sixth commandment. As I mentioned, the activity is a lowly activity, right? It's a good activity, but it's still lowly. It's very pleasurable, but it's still lowly, right? And this is the problem where it's very interesting because in Scripture, there's a reference to, in Scripture, in the Old Testament, it says, her beauty deceiveth thee, right? So it's the pleasure of contemplating a woman's beauty, which the Scripture is saying is what's caused this guy to not see the situation for what it is, right? So the pleasure and the emotional delight and stuff has precipitated his judgment, Okay, so all that being, but then what happens is a lot of times people might fall in a particular area, but then once their head clears and they get back to confession, then they realize, okay, that was pretty bad, and so that they can still suffer the shame in relationship to the fear of being perceived as lowly. But the shame is not just in relationship to the matters of the sixth commandment. In the past, if you pursued or did something that was out of context or was inappropriate, that was considered shameful. So for example, one time this guy comes into my dad's shop and he had this piece of equipment that we were waiting on the part for 2 months and it still wasn't come in. There was no indicator that this thing was going to come in anytime soon. And so the guy says, what do you want to do? And I said, well, what do you think I should do? I said, well, you can either wait or we can sell you a new one, right? A new piece of equipment that you can replace this with. And we can, and so if what you want to do? And he said, well, how much would you give me for this? And I said, well, I don't know if I'm going to be able to fix it. I said, I can probably give you $100 for it, but that's it, right? And he says, okay, let me think about it. So he goes out, and then he comes back in, and then he says something to the effect of, why didn't you just try and sell me this thing first? And I said, because I didn't want to rip you off, right? We might have been able to get it fixed, we might not have. Or this is what it's going to cost to fix your thing, or maybe not. The guy was so stunned that a mechanic wasn't trying to rip him off, right? Mm-hmm. But that tells you something, that pursuit of the money in that particular case was lower than the virtue of integrity. The virtue of integrity is a higher thing than money. And this is what people, so to pursue the money in a situation like that, to rip people off or to do certain things so that they can't, so that you get money away from them or what have you. In other words, lack of honesty to get the money is a lowly thing. You're pursuing a lower thing. Money is a lower thing than integrity or virtue. And so this is why in the past, if they did that, they would just say, that's just shameful, right? Because you're pursuing something lowly, and people would perceive you as lowly. They wouldn't trust you, right? This is true across the board in anything. But this is also becoming more and more being rich should not be the goal. To pursue money over virtue is shameful. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't make as much money as you're capable of making, because that can be shameful too, because you can provided you're developing the other virtues. But you can make a certain amount of money to help other people, or as in the case of what Bug's doing, you can actually develop a system to where it can maximize to help people, in other ways. My basic point is so in other words, you have to look at your talents, pursue what's proper to that according to your state in life. Because sometimes people will say, well, if that's true, then I should only pursue the highest thing. No, that's not true either. So, for example, one time I was at this one monastery, and there's a guy in the monastery, he was a really good egg, he had a heart of gold, but he was dumb as a bag of hammers, right? He would have made a perfect brother, right? And he's just like, I want to study and I want to become knowledgeable in all these areas. Well, dude, that's just outside your capacities, right? So I basically told him, I said, well, go talk to your superiors, right? And just obey them when they tell you what to do. Because I didn't want to tell them, dude, you're just dumb as a bag of hammers. You're just never going to be able to master this information, right? So the point being is that we have to have, and this is where pursuit of the truth is, again, even in relationship to ourselves, is the highest thing. And then we have to talk about how you avoid shame. Well, you just avoid sin, but there's more than that. There are certain things that we should attain, those things that are highest given our state in life and what we're capable of. If we pursue lower things when we're capable, if we were to make changes and detach from certain things and pursue higher things and we don't, that's shameful. That's lowly, because you're pursuing a lower thing over something that's higher, okay? And this is across the board. This is true of all of us. But sometimes people come to me and say, well, I should really then become a priest. No, that's not, you don't have the grace of that vocation. You should become married and pursue the higher virtues there, okay? Whereas if you do have a vocation and you don't pursue it, while it's not sinful, there's a kind of the fact that you pursued something lower, there's a bit of shame involved in that, okay? That all being said, okay. So what this basically means is that, so how do you actually avoid shame? And St. Thomas says there's actually two kinds of shame. He says, the shame that is disordered or excessive, or which is not ordered towards the amendment of our life, is bad, right? So if I feel shame, like for example, the fact that I might not be the best looking person, and then I'm in this room, and then I start feeling shame. Oh man, everyone's going to look at me like I'm ugly. Dude, you are ugly. That's just the nature of the beast. And so you should be, if you had humility, your estimation of yourself would already be at that level. And so when people look down on you, you're not going to feel like you're being perceived lower than you are. You're going to be perceived as you are, right? And this is true not just in relationship to looks, it's a relationship to absolutely everything. If we have absolutely perfect humility, technically speaking, we would never have shame if we had perfect humility. So the shame is actually allowed in order to humble us. This is why St. Thomas says that the reason God allows someone to repeatedly fall into the sixth failures in relationship to the sixth commandment, which he says are lowly activities, is in order to bring their estimation of themselves down, because there's a pride problem. And so if they master humility, generally speaking, the chastity stuff evaporates. Okay, so that being said, so there's usually a pride problem somewhere in there. And it can be in a variety of different ways. It doesn't mean the person has to think, I'm better than everyone else. It can be something that's very hidden. Okay. So that being said, so there's, if we have perfect humility, there's no shame, because you're like, I'm just a wretch anyway, so these people look down on me. Well, that's just me, right? And if I realize that, I'm just another example of fallen human nature, I'm not like the Blessed Virgin, I'm not in this special category that these things don't really apply to me. No, they all apply to me, right? I have darkness of the intellect. I'm dumb, I'm weak-willed, I'm weak in the irascible appetite, and I've got concupiscence. I'm just like everybody else. Now, hopefully I'm working on those and trying to conquer those. But if I just recognize this is my state of who and what I am, then there's just no thing. And this is one of the reasons why, even when you talk about things like the final judgment, people are like, oh, everyone's going to find out all my sins. Oh, shut up. for two reasons. One, you're annoying. Second, actually 3 reasons. Second, everybody else, get in line. Everyone else is going to be seeing all their jazz. So it's not like you're special, that you want to be special. In fact, if you're actually thinking in terms of, I don't want to be like anybody else and be seen as lowly. Well, you are, dude, so get in line. The second component is that if you're on the side of the angels, you have perfect humility, so when people see that, it doesn't faze you in the slightest. Whereas if you're a fallen and you're on the side of the fallen angels, it's brutal, because your pride is going to be constantly brutalized during your judgment, public judgment of it in front of everybody else. This is why the demons say that the final judgment for them is going to be absolutely brutal on the level of shame. Everyone's going to see how truly lowly they really are, because they always try to present themselves above it, And you even see this, even when it comes to their sin. It's kind of like, well, the only reason I sinned is because God didn't give me this. It's God's fault. Yeah, you come on, admit it. Oh, you're right. Okay, so, but the point being is that if we have perfect humility, we'll never have any shame, is basically St. Thomas's point. So then he says, well, then is shame always bad? He says, well, not always. Because sometimes when we do something that's shameful, if it motivates me, if I use it as a motivation, so, well, then I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to use this as a motivation to not out of human respect, but to realize, okay, I'm lowly. I got to lift myself up and start climbing out in this area that I'm lowly. One of the worst things that we can do is ignore those areas where we're lowly, that we keep pursuing those lower things and ignoring them. The worst thing we do is ignore that, because then we never stop doing the lowly thing. We have to take a hard look at it and humility, say, well, that's just me, I'm a glutton, or I'm a fornicator, or whatever. You have to just look at this thing and be brutally honest, because then from there you can say, because it's like anything else, I have to admit this is my problem so that I can start working on it. And if the shame is actually rightly ordered, it will incline the person. The fear will be, I don't want to perceive it lowly, so I'm going to stop pursuing lower things. And so shame can actually be a good thing. And so St. Thomas says that the virtue that moderates the shame in pursuing what's good, or pursuing higher things and avoiding the lowly, is modesty. It's part of modesty. And so this is something which we see people just have no shame today. And this is a sign that they've lost their marbles, they've lost the use of reason is breaking down, because the natural law is being clouded, etc. But whereas if I feel shame, but I have no intention of straightening out my life, he says, that's bad. So the two extremes are absolutely no shame when I do something lowly. And then if I do have shame, but I don't do anything about it, that's bad too. So the virtue in relationship to shame is that I would feel shameful only in those things that I should feel shameful. I should feel shameful the fact that I'm not perfect yet, but that just means that I'm going to motivate myself to actually pursue those things that are higher and that are actually good. But I just wanted you to be able to see that the reason people have no shame today is because of bad formation and habitual sin in our culture. The worst part about it is it's only going to get worse. I keep telling people it's just, if God lets it keep going, it's just a matter of time before people are walking out in public with full nudity and saying, this is my right under the First Amendment of freedom of expression. It's just a matter of time, because people have no shame, and it's breaking down. And you can't even get them to have any sense of shame, even when you tell them, well, you put something of yourself, against the Sixth Commandment on the internet, that could haunt you later when you're trying to get a job. They don't think to themselves, oh, then that's a lowly thing or that's a bad thing. What they do is they think, oh, well, I want money, which is, again, another lowly thing. I mean, it's just, the point being is that they're just messed up today. Okay. So I just wanted you to be able to see why people have no shame today and what shame was, and how to develop the virtue of modesty is really through humility, which is also a sub-virtue to modesty, humility is. And so as you master that, then shame becomes perfected in relationship to that. Which basically means is the more humble you become, the less shame you have. Okay, any questions?
And what, Father?
Yeah.
what's taking place in the faculties when that, false shame or that non-transformative shame, what's taking place in the faculties there? Why, how can that persist?
The way it can persist is the fact that even though the person has the fear of being perceived as lowly, in fact, it's kind of interesting you ask that question, because now what we have is we have people whose lifestyle is openly shameful, but they insist that none of us look at them as being shameful. And basically what that is that that's because there's an attachment still to the activity of the shame. So in other words, even though they feel lowly about it, they don't amend their life because they still have this attachment, using the concupiscible appetite, to some pleasure, something in relationship to it.
Okay, so even if a person is openly admitting shame and not moving forward, and in a lot of cases continuing to move backwards, is that just because of the strength of the attachment to...
It is.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, it could be also there's just not a proportion yet between the amount of shame they're feeling and the attachment. Eventually it becomes so great that they're just like, okay, I'd rather let go of this thing than to continue with the fear. But a lot of times people don't. Especially if the sin is hidden in some way. Like I have a really good friend of mine, he's a good friend of ours. He's overweight. This guy chows down from time to time, right? Outside of that, he's very virtuous guy, very good guy, and I just tell him, well, it's just a sign that your problem is visible to everybody. The bigger danger is when it's not, right? So because when it's not visible to everybody, you're more likely to engage in lower and more lowly things because you don't have to worry about the perception of being seen as lowly. So it's, in one sense, it's actually better for us if everybody knew everything. Not that I'm suggesting everybody go confess their sins publicly, but it's actually better for most people. Their opportunities of growing in virtue are basically greater when people find out about stuff than when they don't. Yeah.
But you think another problem today is people don't have the experience of the higher things. Like
yes. Yeah, I think that's
it.
it.
A nice liturgy or reading reading all these things so they don't have that. So
right. I think that's part of the formation issue, right? So it's either bad formation or sin, and I think in this particular case, it's just they don't have the right formation.
Right.
When we grew up, our parents instilled in us a very rightly ordered shame. If you said something or did something and then it drew undue attention to you, which was immodest, your parents was like, that's shameful, don't do that, right? And so it would build up, it can actually develop a rightly ordered shame. Because, oh, well, I got overboard. Well, maybe, but it's much easier to moderate the shame if you actually have it than to actually build it if you don't. So, yes.
Isn't there a responsibility? I know with leaders of the world, the presidents of the Vatican, the Pope, when you have a good one, when you have a good Pope and a good president, doesn't that make the society better? Isn't it a true connection on such as your parents?
Yeah.
These are our leaders. So when I think of Pope Francis and all the years that he's been in, it just seems like that's where society has gone down now. They're saying sodomy is good.
Or it's not a crime or whatever, yeah.
So that's huge. I just feel that's really affecting children, and the millennials, and that they see going on.
Yeah, I think that just goes back to the formation thing again. It's just bad formation. But that also tells you the converse of that, of what you were saying. Rightly ordered leaders, rightly ordered parents, or parents that encourage the kids to pursue the higher goods, the virtue primarily, according to their state in life. That good formation will instill a natural sense of shame, just automatically.
And even though they have that natural sense of shame, but they continue, our friends and relations, that attachment to them, that's sometimes that tough thing they're connected to is what that person's always thinking or...
That's right, yeah. Yeah, in the end
It's hard
too.
to get 'em out of that
See,
relationship.
part of the rightly ordered shame, I'm glad you mentioned that. Part of the rightly ordered shame is that your fear of being perceived as lowly, when it's rightly ordered, is incongruity with reality, that it is lowly. One of the things is we get a false sense of shame in our culture when people try and say that that's lowly, when in point in fact it's not lowly. And so this is a key thing. So like, for example, there's times in which we just have to be willing to cut bait with certain friends or with certain people in order to pursue what's truly higher, even though they're going to look down on it. And that's a key thing in all our lives. And that means that a lot of times they may not think that you're pursuing the higher thing or that you're becoming useless or whatever. The fact is, I'm pursuing the higher thing. And so, but we're getting a false sense of shame. In fact, part of the shame is being perceived as lowly is in our culture. They're telling us certain things are lowly when in point in fact they're not lowly, right? Being religious is a lowly thing. It's a crutch because you just, obviously it's a cycle. You need this and etc. But those of us who are intelligent, we've put aside religion and this type of nonsense, right? And so that's what you get is there's this inversion that's actually happened. What's happening is the news media is trying to indicate that these things are like, for example, I mean, right now, we're being told that just being a white male is racist de facto, right? And that's shameful. You should be ashamed of the fact that you're a white male. Well, what am I going to do? I can't change my gender and I can't change my race. What am I going to do? And basically, that's how one of the indicators is that the shame that they're trying to put on people doesn't order anything in a rightly ordered fashion. It doesn't help me. It doesn't help other people become more noble. But that's what we're actually beginning to see is they're trying to present as lowly things that aren't lowly in order to shame us into those things.
Right, and they also try to make us perceive those things that are lowly as being.
Right.
It's like,
Well, and the other thing that they're actually doing is that they're criticizing you if you legitimately look down on things that are truly lowly. Fat shaming. But the fact that now that you have these big obese women and they're in order not to fat shame these and make them socially acceptable, they're putting them on the front cover of Vogue. You're just like, that's just not helpful. And it's not helpful to them, right? So the point being is that they're, even when if you look down on, things like sodomy, that's even lower than a normal conjugal act that's rightly ordered. Because normal conjugal act is actually a good thing. This is just even lower than that. And the fact that you would say something like that, they're just like, you shouldn't do that. They love each other. In other words, they're trying to ennoble this thing or make it a good thing when in fact, it's just as base as it gets. I mean, even animals aren't that disordered, right? Although they always point to some weird ape somewhere that does this stuff, right? But it's just like, look it. The fact of the matter is the fact that you don't see that generally in even animals as a sign that there's just something wrong with it, right? But the point being is that they're trying to take these things that are really disordered and make them noble, and then take the things that are truly noble and lower them. And we're seeing that across the board.
What fascinates me is just, especially my generation, is how uncommitted people are to each other in a relationship, especially women. I've
Right.
heard multiple times women, some married,
Yeah.
who literally, and I probably shouldn't have been in certain situations, shouldn't put myself in these areas to kind of just avoid this situation, but in a general sense, it would fascinate me. Just, I have a boyfriend, or I'm married, but that's okay. It, almost like it's like they could care less if I slept with them that night or something like that.
Well, and therein lies a very important point, because basically what it is that for them to volitionally tie yourself exclusively to one individual is almost like a quasi-slavery. You should have a certain kind of freedom and shouldn't tie yourself in that way. You should have a certain, if something better comes along, well, then why not? I mean, you should. And so I think what it really boils down to is it's the exaltation of freedom over truth. There is no true freedom without truth.
And there's no shame. I'm married, but I'm like,
Yeah, there is no
To
shame.
me, I'm kind of like, well, I'm kind of guilty just hanging out with you. What am I doing?
Well, and the minute they say something that's like super shameful, and you're just like, ooh.
Yeah, right.
They see you recoiling, which should be the natural thing to do, and they just go bananas. Why? Because their feelings are hurt because they're feeling the fear of the shame. So, okay. Any other questions?
The will, when you said, ladies always say that. What was it?
It's because, as Pius XII said, the predominance of women in the home is to be in relationship to love. Women are just more inclined to that because of their disposition and nature, right? Doesn't mean they're not inclined to the truth. That's not what I'm saying. But it's just that's kind of their role, is to foster love in a family, and so that's why they tend to think it's higher, I think. But anyway, all right. If you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et semper. Amen.